Hi everyone, this is Bradley. I am recording this after our conversation, and I think you will enjoy it, but I just wanted to say a few things really quick here. My views, or Stark's views, are not representational of Carpatho-Rusyn's, or at least not representational of all of them, of course. And yes, a lot of this is obvious, but sometimes it's nice just to clarify things in the beginning. I am offering a perspective, not the perspective. And then secondly, I would like to address that I did a very bad job interviewing. This was my first time trying, and I didn't realize how much of a skill it was until after this interview. I did ask some interesting questions though, and I did ask some provocative questions. But my delivery and my intellectual sharpness was not quite what it could have been for a few reasons. This was recorded right after I got off of a very long day of work, and I assumed I could just wing it. But again, this is a learning experience for me. Regardless, I think that you will enjoy this interview slash conversation. That is, if you were attracted to click on this talk in the first place. So we talk about Carpatho-Rusyns and their unique place in history, as well as in the modern world. But we also talk about, or rather, a few themes pop up again and again throughout this long conversation. Some of which are ethnicity, ethnic identity, diaspora, among a few others. And then I do try to understand some of Stark's interesting perspectives. So I do hope you appreciate my eagerness to uh, make some clarifications and thoroughly work out what exactly are his ideas. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say before our discussion. I think you will enjoy it, and I thank Stark very much for joining me, and I hope you enjoy the talk. Thank you.
All right, everyone. Hello. And today I have a very special guest. I've been following his work for quite a while. And with me I have Starik Pollock.
Hey, nice to be here, and I'm glad you invited me onto your channel. I've been watching your content for quite a long time. You of course focus on different topics, primarily
Yeah,
me, but
very different.
yeah, it's very different. But I think all European history is equally interesting, except for maybe the Spaniards. I'm not a huge fan of the whole
Oh, wow.
Hispania, but sorry,
They're
Spaniards.
barely Europe. I mean,
Yeah, I
just kidding.
know.
Um,
But yeah.
yeah, so if you'd like to introduce yourself
Yeah, sure.
and what you do.
My name is Stark, as you said. I am a Rusyn American from the Midwest, and I am the founder and managing director of the Rusyn Literature Society. We are a small business focused on the production of intellectual thought and sovereignty within the Rusyn community. That started roughly 2 years ago. But but before that, I was writing books. I still write books, but I had started to write books before that, and I had a history channel on YouTube called LemkoWithHistory. It's just kind of short, couple minute long videos about Rusyn topics, Eastern Europe. But as for my books, I've written a couple. They primarily focus on geopolitics and Rusyn issues. These being primarily sovereignty, duty to fulfill a national vision, a critique of Western influence, when foreign powers come and influence internal politics, in all these things. So that's my primary focus.
All right, and I'm sure a lot of this is very foreign to a good portion of my audience. So what I hope to do here is I do want to cover who the Rusyns are because I'm sure a lot of people are unfamiliar, but I'm also sure that that you probably get that question far too much. So no?
Yeah, I would say I used to at the start, but I really don't get many beginner questions anymore, kind of intro questions anymore. So I'm very happy to get one again. I haven't
Oh,
drawn that
okay. Great,
for a
great.
long time, so.
Yeah, so then I want to get into a little bit of history, and I have read / listened to some of your books. So I do have a few concepts I'd like to talk about because I haven't seen you elaborate on them too much. I mean, on your channel you have somewhat, but there's a few specific things I want to talk about. So this interview is my excuse to do that.
Wonderful.
Now I've been, I don't want to say dragged, but I've been gradually pushed into the world of Rusyns. I mean, I have the Rusyn flag behind me
You
because
do have the Rusyn flag,
I
a beautiful one with the
yes,
old bear on it, even.
it's,
So you have quite a lot of street
the
cred.
old bear?
Yes, he's the old. That's the old one, the ones that Carpathians still use.
Okay.
Everyone else uses a new one now, but
I didn't know that.
But that's a good flag right there.
Okay.
Good stuff.
Well, that is my girlfriend Isabel's flag, and she's also very into your videos and your content. She's not here right now, but that's how I've been pushed into the world of the Rusyns because, of course, she is part Rusyn. And myself, I'm an American European mutt, right? So I'm German, Swedish, Swiss, and a little Slovak. As far as I know, I'm not Rusyn. But I have grown gradually interested in this group. So if you when you come across someone who doesn't know what a Rusyn is, how do you describe who they are to them in a very short, 3 or 4 sentences?
I would say Rusyns are an East Slavic people who inhabit the Eastern Carpathian Mountains, and right now they spread out over multiple countries in Central and Eastern Europe. That's generally my first approach, because generally when people ask, they're like, are these people Slavs? Are they, Germanic? What are they exactly? I've even had some people ask, are they Roma? It's kind of a wide range, but that's usually my introduction, and then I kind of go in further there if they are interested.
So they are one of the East Slavic groups.
Yep. So there's 4 East Slavic groups. Primarily, you have the Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, and also Rusyns. You have also kind of subgroups within that are quite interesting, but those are the 4 major branches, so to speak.
On your interview with Samuel's Fortress, you talked about the Lemkos a bit, and I guess you are, nearly, you're very Rusyn, but you're not as Lemko as you thought you were?
Yeah, so I mean, I think originally when I started out the channel, I had many misunderstandings, and so I do have Lemko ancestors, primarily from central Lemkovina, right by the Slovak-Polish border. But most of my family, from both my father's and my mother's side, actually comes from the Prešov region. So this is, they're just kind of standard Rusnoks, just kind of like Rusyns.
Right.
They are closely related to the Lemkos, but they don't have any special name or anything like that. They're just
okay.
So, yeah.
And now, do you have anything outside of your Rusyn heritage?
Yeah, like a little bit here or there, whether it be just like a little bit of kind of a Silesian German, a little bit from the Caucasus region, a little bit. I don't really think any Polish. Maybe like 1 or 2 Rusyn guys married a Polish lady.
Right.
I can't really confirm that. But I mean, just to kind of lay it out, pretty much all 4 of my grandparents are at least mostly Rusyn, pretty much, or at least half Rusyn. So I mean, it's kind of across the board. My family's from central Minnesota, and a population of, I think, of that whole area is like maybe like a couple thousand, and I'm the first generation who hasn't lived there. So it's kind of, it was a very isolated population, which, it did wonders for keeping my Rusynness, I guess. So.
Now, growing up, did you know you were Rusyn?
No, I knew there was always something different. So, for example, like my grandfather, he's in his 90s now, or he'll be 100 in a couple years. He always told me that he said, we go to Polish festivals, we do Polish dances. Some of us speak Polish, but grandson, I want you to know that you're not Polish. I can't really tell you what, but my dad always said, never forget that you're not Polish. And so he didn't really understand like more than that. He still doesn't really, and same with like my other grandparents. They kind of said, yeah, we're not Polish or German, but we're something else.
Okay.
So, I mean, it was always present that I wasn't that, but just kind of what is that? That was always difficult to determine, really.
Yeah, I think ethnicity and ancestry is so interesting in the U.S. or the New World in general. I mean, I feel like a lot of Americans, I'd say, Black Americans and white Americans, you always have the option of leaning more into what you are or kind of ignoring it and falling more into a general American or a regional identity.
Well, it also greatly depends on kind of many different factors that I find quite interesting. So, for example, I think that American hasn't, not to get too far into politics here because that's not the point, but
We will
I think
a little later.
Yeah, of course. But I think like being American is just straight American. I think that's kind of falling out of favor, so to speak, especially over the past decade or two. So it's not surprising that many people are trying to cling to some other, some other heritage or something like that. I also think it's dependent on when your ancestors came over here, right? So, for example, for mine, I came over in, 1900, 1910, 1920. It's still very close compared to someone who came on like the Mayflower or something, right? So all these different factors, it's always been a fascinating subject.
Now, I feel like I have a lot of ancestors that are older stock, and I feel like I'm still able to, I feel like I'm still the result of them. I still have a little bit of that, German Protestant work ethic or whatever. And I grew up Protestant, so Lutheran. So I feel like I still have a bit of that German in me, although most of my German came in the 1700s.
Yeah.
So I don't always think it's the most recent ancestors that are necessarily the most impactful.
I would
think on
agree.
average, you're probably right, though.
Well, I think another big thing, too, is how do the home countries interact with the diaspora, right? So for example, if you take, let's say Poland, for example, many Polish Americans, they are very proud of being Polish, but people from Poland don't necessarily see them as part of the Polish nation, so to speak, or, you see this in Japan where many Japanese Brazilians went back and they were treated very poorly. I think it kind of depends in that sense of that if the host nation is very welcoming of this diaspora, it kind of energizes people's association with it, right? So, especially for Rusyns, like we have songs sung in the homeland about, hey, my uncle went, there's one, I forgot the name of it. It's like, my uncle went to America and like never came back, or, it like it's a very closely knit between these. So I think that's also another big factor.
Now, in your life, but before you did more research into your ancestry, were there notable cultural differences or things you noticed that your family does that is significantly different from neighbors or other people you've had close connections with?
Well, I think it's hard to say entirely because the area my family's from, it's called Stearns County, and it's kind of famous for being really peculiar in Minnesota, for being like totally different from the rest of Minnesota. So I can't say how much of this is like the difference between that county and everyone else versus like ancestry, right? I mean, but there's a lot of things of where like we would, my extended family says like a whole bunch of Polish swear words and things like that.
Okay.
And, we always wanted to like have a borscht or something. It was like a lot of these things in which just general Minnesotans have no idea about. So, I mean, that was always present, but nothing too crazy, right? Nothing that I would necessarily say stands out too much. But I mean, if you said you were from Stearns County, everyone knew you were a little bit peculiar. So.
Okay. Did religion play a role in your upbringing?
No, actually, I was raised atheist. My family.
You were raised atheist.
I was raised atheist.
Okay.
Yes. My family before them was very religious. They came over as Greek Catholics, and a couple were Orthodox. We actually had an Orthodox church. If you guys go to my channel, you can see the video of what I did of the cemetery. My family grew up a couple miles from there. So there were certainly different influences. If you go to like Catholic churches up there, they have some Greek Catholic practices. They still do and things like that. But for me personally, religion wasn't even part of it. I was raised in a strongly anti-religious household.
Okay. I think with me, religion is one of the things that did really connect me to.
Oh, really?
My heritage.
Mm-hmm.
Myself, I'm atheist, but
Yeah.
I regularly went to both Lutheran and Mennonite churches.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like without that, how much, would I know I'm German? If I had a different last name.
Right. Yeah.
So
I'll tell you a thing of why perhaps it wasn't necessarily a big deal in my case, or at least associating with not necessarily just being, not just being American, is that, up there, of course people are like religious, right? But, the big thing is that ethnic organizations and like ethnic festivals and things were huge up there and still are to some extent, so, where like, some people would just go to like, some dance or something like that. The whole like polka club was open, and so like there's so many different cultural elements besides the church that, I mean, it was not hard to, even if you weren't religious, to connect with that culture.
Okay. So I was raised in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, which also has a lot of those festivals, and it's really interesting because a lot of people there who, they don't have a drop of Slavic blood or Hungarian blood or anything.
Yeah.
And they still go to these festivals, and, nearly everyone knows how to make pierogies or pilipki or whatever. So it is a very interesting a place. And it sounds like where you're from is somewhat similar.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how close your town specifically is to any like major kind of urban zone. Like, I don't know particularly about that, but where my family's from, I mean, there's nowhere within. I mean, you have St. Cloud, which is a small city of like 20,000 people, like an hour and a half away, and like the Twin Cities are like 3 hours away. So I mean, it's really like you're really in the middle of nowhere. And, so I mean, there might be some differences there, but I certainly didn't see necessarily that type of unity of like everyone there. Like, for example, like the Germans had their association up there, the Polish had theirs, the Hungarians had theirs. Like it was still quite divided, and still is now to some extent.
Yeah, and I'm sure it's very different living in, would you call it the Midwest?
Like upper Midwest, yeah.
Upper Midwest. I'm sure it's different there than in Western Pennsylvania.
Yeah, I would certainly say so. Probably. There's probably some East Coast influence.
Oh, yeah. It's interesting. So, like, by Pittsburgh, it's, I'm at the intersection of the East Coast and then the Midwest and the Rust Belt. Mm-hmm. So it's really such a clash of worlds. And you talk to different people and you're like, oh yeah, that guy seems like he's from the Midwest. He says pop instead of soda, you know.
It's not soda, it's pop. I'll tell you that right
Oh
now.
yeah?
Oh yeah, it's
Does
definitely
anyone
pop.
say pop
Oh, everyone
in
says pop here.
Minnesota? Oh
No,
yeah?
no one says soda. Yeah,
Okay.
no one says
Okay.
soda.
Uh, so I'd like to get into some history here. I want to talk about the Rus because, of course, this is where the Rusyns get their name, right?
Correct. Yes, yes. I mean, this is the ancestral legacy from that kingdom, or shall I say, principalities.
Do you know the earliest time we've seen the word Rusyn?
I
It's usually
can't.
Ruthenian.
Well, Ruthenian actually comes much later.
Okay.
Ruthenian comes. I mean, I believe like the Rus were sometimes referred in Western sources to that, but where Ruthenian really comes into play is actually after the fall of the Kievan Rus to the Golden Horde, and once this kind of splitting cultures between the Muscovite branch of the Rus and everyone else who kind of gets absorbed into the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, this is when this kind of division happens and where you start hearing Ruthenian more. But before then, it wasn't necessarily as common. Or like Ruthenian has a very special connotation, which excludes Russians. So I mean, this is an important distinction to make
Right.
of like a couple centuries later.
Now, what influence did the Rus have on the Carpathian Mountains? Now, of course, this is before the Rusyns really developed into who they are today. But who were the people at the time of the Rus? Who were the people that lived on those mountains?
Well, largely the place was completely unsettled. You had various kind of small Rus tribes or villages, shall we say, especially on the northern slopes. But when we're talking about the inner Carpathians and then kind of the southern slopes, it was incredibly underpopulated. It was kind of seen as the no man's land between the Kingdom of Hungary and Galicia, Volhynia. It's kind of like a successor Rus principality. So, I mean, during this time, there's not much at play. It's not really under the rule of the Kievan Rus nor the Kingdom of Hungary. So,
Yeah, no, I think usually with maps you see the Rus, they kind of border the Carpathians,
yeah, it's
or
like
they stop there, and they probably don't um, go too far into them.
well, there's pretty good records of northern slope settlement, and shall we
Okay.
say maybe 5-10 miles inside. But if you go further, there's pretty much nothing, especially from the Hungarian side.
Okay. Now, I online I've ran into a lot of people of Russian and Ukrainian descent that believe that the Rusland was this grand Scandinavian Viking kingdom. And here you run into a lot. I don't know if you're familiar with people who are into the Hyperborean stuff.
Kind
Have
of.
you
I
ever
mean,
heard of that?
well, I mean, you kind of get into like the Normanist, like anti-Normanist kind of theories with with these things. I mean, I think that. I mean, do you want my opinion of that kind of
Oh, of
take,
course,
I
yeah.
suppose?
I don't agree with it, obviously, but
No,
I
no,
have
of
some
course.
commenters that have brought up things like that, saying that the Russians are the true successors of the Vikings or whatever. And but yeah, what were you gonna say?
Well, I mean, if we take this from the written records that we have, and if we just kind of analyze everything, I think there's a pretty strong evidence to say that at least at the beginning of the Rus, that there was a Scandinavian elite from, whether it be from southern Finland, eastern Sweden, somewhere in that kind of region. They migrate to the rivers of the Great Eastern Plain, and they kind of take over control of these vast East Slavic lands and people. But when you see where, for example, Scandinavian names or Scandinavian, shall we just say names, kind of be Slavicized, so to speak. I mean, we're only really talking about 100 years, maybe, at max, before this Scandinavian elite assimilates into the general Slavic peoples around them. So Scandinavians were never the general population. And at max, I think, you're probably looking at 1 to 3% of the total population ever, right? So that's my kind of view on it, I suppose.
Now, I have to ask because Isabel's very interested in this, and she's brought it up a few times. And I try to pull her in a bit because I don't really know the history here. Yeah. But do you know much about, pre-Christian religion in
I suppose it
the land of the
depends on the area. Well, I mean, if we're talking about like certain religious practices, not necessarily, just kind of maybe perhaps from like a general overview standpoint of that, one of the big things that is the problem with the Kievan Rus is that kind of after they are Christianized, you get much more extensive records and file keeping and things like this, and kind of the paganist time, so to speak, is quite underwritten. But I think that's a problem with all early Slavic peoples and kingdoms. So I don't necessarily have anything specific to say on that. It's not really my specialty, to be honest.
Okay. Well, she's very interested in looking at where, of course, we have the Indo-European pantheon, but she's really interested in where this, Earth Mother worship comes from. Mm-hmm. Because there are written sources that do reference this kind of thing that we don't see, at least we don't see the Germans doing them. So maybe other Indo-European groups do worship the Earth in this similar manner. And but she's trying to figure out, where that comes from.
Well, I would tell her that is actually a quite fascinating topic. I can't help her at all, but that's quite fascinating, honestly. So.
She'll go off on it occasionally on my channel, and I have to calm her down because I don't want her to say anything too crazy. So I'm very, I try to be very conservative when it comes to speculative history. But yeah. So I guess we should let the audience know who are the major players when it comes to the formation of the Rusyn people.
Well, I mean, if we're talking about players, I think there's many different forces at work here. If you can name specific. So let's back up for a second and let's just talk about Rusyn development or Rusyn settlement, right? So you have a small East Slavic population within the Carpathians, let's say around the 1200s, 1300s. Now, at the behest of the Kingdom of Hungary, there are many Rus settlers from Galicia, Volhynia, Podolia. These are areas in now Western Ukraine. And then you have Wallachians, who are kind of the remnants of the kind of Roman Latin-speaking empire within the Balkans. They were fleeing the Ottoman army. They migrate and populate these villages. And they start in what is now Eastern Slovakia, and they move from west to east, ending in Maramuresh, which is now part of Romania. And so you see it from like the 1200s to about the 1700s, this kind of great Ruthenian settlement. And so it's interesting in terms of there's no necessarily any big national starting point or national kind of, you can say, hey, this is exactly when it happened. One of the big issues in kind of talking about these things of formation is that many times these towns and villages, they would be settled by completely different people at completely different times. And so I like to tell people of it like this, is that, so say you have some Lemko village that was settled by people from the plains of Galicia, which is just north of Carpathian Rus, in the 1400s. What do they truly have in common besides kind of a general Rusyn identity from some place in eastern Subcarpathia that was settled in the 1700s by people from Podolia? So there's no real national formation until we get into the early 1800s. You see the kind of birth of nations and the revolutions in 1848. And this is generally when people say like the kind of Rusyn national ethos starts. You have people like Alexander Duknovich. He was a priest from what is now also Eastern Slovakia. He popularizes the idea that Rusyns are kind of a separate people and should be divided from Hungary. He was of the Russophile orientation, as many early activists were. So, so in this way, essentially, to put it short, so you can ask questions. It started in about the 1850s, and it was born out of a kind of Russophile orientation to unite with Russia. So that's the kind of general overview.
Okay, then of course they never get to forming their own state.
No, it never happened. It probably could have been attempted after World War One, but the intelligentsia of the Rusyns at the time found that there was no real economic possibility that Carpathian Rus would survive on its own. So they eventually united with Czechoslovakia, and that's a whole story on its own. But I'm certainly willing to clarify anything or go further if you are interested.
No, I think you're making a lot of sense, and I apologize. I'm just now realizing how difficult it is to interview. I haven't done it before.
Oh,
yeah, you're doing so much heavy lifting, and I just you're doing great.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, usually I accidentally poke people with too much information. So feel free to always say, hey.
No, it's fantastic.
Yeah.
It's great. So ideally, in your mind, would you have preferred that there was a larger attempt for state building after World War I?
Well, I think, I mean, of course, I would have certainly wanted that. I just don't think we were ready, being quite frank. I think that in terms of national development, we were 20, 30, 40 years behind the Slovaks, the Ukrainians, the Croatians. I mean, we were, just to be honest, a kind of backwards province, or the multiple counties we were, a part of. We had seen a huge brain drain, from the more prosperous regions of the Rusyns to the New World, and we were not intellectually ready. And this shows in kind of two things, I suppose. Number one is the inability to procure independence when small states like Czechoslovakia could. And number two was in the governor of Subcarpathia. I'm going to butcher his name. I think it was Gregory Zhatkovich, I believe. The LemkoWithHistory Republic on the northern slopes wanted to unite with Subcarpathian Rus, but he denied it, saying it was too difficult of a proposition. I mean, it's just, these essential failings where, just lack of statesmanship, lack of kind of forward thinking, we just weren't ready. And so there's no point in saying, oh yeah, we should have, because we just weren't ready, as was clearly evident.
Okay. Now, plenty of people groups live in the Carpathians, and it seems like that's always been the case. Has there always been a level of ethnic diversity in the around the Rusyns?
Well, certainly yes. I mean, I would say, if we just look at the Carpathians from, say, the Czech Republic down to Romania, right? You have the Moravian Wallachians, you have the Gorals, you have the Rusyns, you have what's their name? The Transylvanian Hungarians. I know how to spell that, but I'm not going to offend Hungarians by trying to pronounce it. So yes, diversity was very big, and also, of course, the Jews made up a large percentage before World War II. I can't say the exact amount, but probably like a fourth, a third of the total population, something like that.
And when did a substantial Jewish population arise? Is that
Yeah,
like
so you're looking at
1700s?
like 16, 1700s, yeah. It was mostly Hasidic Jews who came from Galicia, as many other Ruthenians did that came from
Okay.
Galicia, and they settled here. What's interesting with the Jews especially is because, of course, there was folk stories about some difficulties and, just like ethnic strife. But largely, I mean, like Sub-Carpathia never had any pogroms. They never had any like revolts against Jews. It is actually quite a mutual understanding. Like it was quite peaceful compared to Galicia, for example, where Jews were treated horribly, right? Or kind of the whole Pale of Settlement area, they were treated horribly. Where Sub-Carpathia, that wasn't really the case. So.
Okay. Yeah, I guess we can talk a bit about America now. So the Rusyns, along with plenty of other ethnic groups,
Mhm.
I believe it really started off in the late, I don't know, like the 1880s? Is that
Yep.
too late?
About, I think the first one was made in 1877, so
Okay.
not very far off, no.
Okay. And so the Rusyns settled in America,
Mhm.
and they have assimilated to some extent, but they still retain a few core features. Uh, and now, if it's okay, I'd like to go into a little bit of philosophy and uh, maybe a little politics, if that's okay.
Go ahead, you're the
Okay.
host.
Unless there's anything else you want to fill out with history. I think you did a great job. It's just
Yeah,
I'm not as familiar as you are, so is
like
there
I
anything
think if
else
we
you'd
need to
like
go
to?
to it, like I think if we need to go back to something, we will, but I
Okay,
don't think there's anything right now, no.
great. So, I I am very jealous of people like you and people like Isabel who have this um, ethnicity that they can, like I said earlier, lean into, learn more about,
Mhm.
and they're accepted by a community.
Mhm.
Um, it's interesting because I feel like there's a lot of larger ethnicities. I mean, the Rusyns are very small in population worldwide.
Mhm.
There's, I see people struggling. I see French Louisianans struggling to,
Yeah.
coordinate with each other and preserve their language in any way.
Yeah.
So I think it's pretty interesting how the Rusyn community has, or really just how accepting it is, and I feel like I'm almost part of it at this point. But
You might as well be, at this point,
I know
if you
I
two
might
ever
as
get
well lie.
married and have kids, your
Oh, well,
kids are
that's
going to be
true.
partners, so, you might
That
as
is
well be a
true.
part of it.
I do have to ask though,
Mhm.
how how do you justify the legitimacy of your Rusyn identity as an American? I know it's a big question
How do I
because it's
legitimize it
obvious.
in what sense, I suppose?
So, um, people with Rusyn heritage in the U.S.
Mm,
and Canada are obviously culturally different than people in
mm,
Europe.
yeah.
So how do you justify your rightful connection to the homeland? And
Well,
and in,
I think on some level, we can get very deeply philosophical on this point, but I think on some level, for me in particular, I suppose, I think it was number one, the kind of ancestral relations and saying, hey, my family was from here, going back hundreds of years. I'm still trying to preserve what they have left today. I think that was a very, kind of that kind of phrase, I suppose, was very important for me at the start. I think now, honestly, I don't even necessarily think of it like that because I mean, I'm just gonna be honest. People from the homeland like me better than the people in people in America. So I mean, it's like all of the many people know me. I talk to people from the homeland all the time. Like it doesn't feel like I need to quantify anything or like legitimize anything. I mean, people say you're like you're one of us. I don't necessarily like. I certainly felt more what you're saying at the start, but now that I've like I know so many people and I'm kind of entrenched in that, it's not really something that's on my mind, I suppose.
Okay, so it is really about the community, and do you think you would feel?
Well, I think that I'd have a hard time legitimizing being Rusyn to myself if the community didn't accept me. I would say, I think that's certainly a big thing. Is like if I was like some like Italian American and I went to Italy and I said I was Italian and then people would like laugh at me. I think that would be I think that would be pretty crushing, right? But here, this is where I kind of start earlier in our interview of kind of it matters supremely what the homeland, what their interaction with the diaspora is like. So, for example, like if you see like I know it's slightly different, but if you see like a Jew from America goes to Israel, he's still a Jew. He might not be an Israeli, but they still see him as one of them, right? And Rusyns from the homeland still especially see us from America as one of them, I think it's not necessarily healthy, but in some ways we've almost been glorified by them. Like, we escaped the prosecution of like the 1900s, and this is something that not a lot of people want to talk about, but it's this kind of looked up to in a sense that I'm not necessarily comfortable with, but it kind of helps this kind of integration between diaspora and then like the homeland population.
Okay. And it's kind of ironic because I think a lot of Rusyns did plan to return to Europe.
Oh, most of them
I don't
did.
know if it's the majority of them.
Oh, no, it was by far the majority. They wanted to, essentially they were on contracts to go work in the mines, get enough money, then come back and either improve their homestead or buy land and build a house. I mean, this was, for most of them, this was the purpose. I mean, funny enough, from the community I'm from, that was not their purpose. They said, I'm going to get the hell out of Dodge.
Right.
Because they were farmers and they bought houses and such. But, I mean, overwhelmingly, that was the case.
Do you notice, or would you, this is a hard question to ask, would you consider some Americans as LARPers of their own ethnicity?
I don't.
Because there is a point where it becomes ridiculous, right? I mean, I think with like Irish Americans and St. Patrick's Day or something.
Whereas, well, I think. Sorry, go on.
There's a way to unauthentically try to bridge yourself with the old world and with your ancestors in a cheap way.
Well, I think a couple things from that. I mean, I think first of all, your example, I think it's a very, it's very interesting because things like, St. Patrick's Day and stuff. I mean, from what I've read, I don't think it's necessarily celebrated as much actually in Ireland versus America, and things like that. I mean, I think it's very superficial and it's almost like tokenism in a sense of like, or kind of a thing to make yourself look different from just being American, right? I think there's certainly a lot of that. I think there's certainly like, I just want to be interesting to people. And so I'm going to say, I'm like, I'm Irish or, something like that. I don't mean to criticize people too much, but I mean, I think that's probably the majority, I would say, honestly, of just
the majority of Americans who try to connect themselves with
well, I'd say probably
culture, or?
Of kind of European Americans who try to connect it in the sense that I don't necessarily, from what I've seen, they don't necessarily try to connect in a very legitimate sense, but kind of more as in like a kind of superficial sense. So I'll give an example here, right, of like plenty of people will say like, we can go back to Irish Americans again.
Sure.
Plenty of people will say they're Irish Americans, right? Or they'll say they're Irish, but how many of them learn how to speak the Irish language? I forgot what its name is. Or how many people, if you ask them on the spot, hey, tell me some Irish history, how much would they know? Probably,
Yeah.
barely any. Or, coming from the standpoint of how many of them have actually been to Ireland? Or how many of them want to go to Ireland? Or feel like, they want to move there? I mean, these are things of like, it's such a superficial level that I don't necessarily blame many Europeans for being like, hey, this is very, I shouldn't say funny, but kind of odd, I would say. Yeah.
Right.
I think Rusyns are certainly better at it. I mean, many are very serious about connecting in a legitimate way, and I think that really helps us. There's not a lot of superficial, hey, I'm a Rusyn and I'm going to drink to some holiday twice a year, and that's it. It's certainly more than that.
Okay. Yeah, I don't think I've seen it too much in the Rusyn community, so it is interesting how they tend to avoid it. And a lot of it might be that no one, or not a lot of Americans know that they're Rusyn. So to know that you're Rusyn is already like a step in the right direction.
Oh, well, I mean,
Or
certainly
to figure it
so.
out.
I mean, but I also think that, like, if, say, like, for Irish Americans, I mean, they were pretty much completely disconnected with what was going on in Ireland, where if you look at Rusyns, even after World War One, there was, like, Rusyn American organizations that communicated with the homeland and try to get some type of deal planned out. I mean, Rusyn Americans were very heavily involved in the politics of World War One, of what would become of the Rusyns, right? And so it's like these things that are that other communities just don't really have, I should say.
I'm sorry. Sounds like they're mowing at my apartment complex. Were you able to hear much of that?
I didn't hear anything, actually.
Okay.
So I can, you can always apply one of those noise canceling things, or whatever.
Yeah, I might have to go back in here and touch some of this up. So you did mention briefly that there is this force that is driving a lot of Americans to, latch on to a particular identity. And I mean, do you think it always has to be an ethnic identity, or they're just searching for anything that's going to make them something that is not a standard American?
I think it's two things primarily. I think one, you have the now increased importance on ethnicity in American society, or shall we say, like, what are you? You can't just be American. You have to be white American, black American, Asian American. And I think for many, they're like trying to sift through what any of that means. I mean, I don't think we need to get too in-depth on that, but I mean, it's a very complicated situation with how ethnicity has been used, ethnicity and race has been used kind of, especially within the last 5 years in kind of American society. I mean, I think that's a huge one, is that people are trying to find something, to kind of like sift through that. And I think
what do you mean by that? Sift through, like?
Well, I think it's kind of a thing of like where, I mean, I think that, a lot of like white Americans get the impression that like, they're very kind of basic, I suppose. So like, they don't have any culture or something like that. And like, like all Americans have like kind of like general American culture. So I'm not really, I don't necessarily agree with that. But at least in the Midwest, it's very much that, hey, just a bunch of like cream cheesers, you don't really have anything, you go to, you go to Starbucks and you go to like Red Lobster, and so I think it's something about like, to make, to be like, oh, I'm cool, I'm Irish American, Italian American, something like that. And I think the second one is that I think it is kind of the breakdown of American as an identity in a solidified form. I mean, you still have this in the South where English ancestry is very underreported because people just call themselves American, right? but I think the kind of breakdown of just being an American and just American society in a kind of civilized sense. I think that kind of this. I mean, if there's this gaping hole now, you're going to try to fill it with something else. It doesn't have to be ethnicity, right? It could be, you see many people doing many different things. So you see people who are super into Star Trek, and this is kind of like their new main identity. People into religion, or I'm a libertarian, and that's like kind of my main identity. Ethnicity is just one of those things. But I think it is a thing if people are trying to latch on, because local communities and just kind of the general national community has certainly started to fall apart in many ways.
Okay, I think we're mostly on the same page here. I do have a little story. So I typically try to encourage people I know who, so maybe I'm partially to blame for what we're talking about, but I usually try to encourage people I know to look into their ethnicity if they don't know what they are, or if they feel like they're rootless. So I did encourage one of my close friends to do this.
Mm-hmm.
And he's like, oh, well, I know I'm Welsh, so I'm going to do some research on the Welsh. And sorry, can you hear the lawnmower?
No, I can't hear anything.
Are you serious? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, Google Meet is good.
Well, it has automatic noise cancellation, so.
Yeah, that's great. It seems like it's better than Zoom. But, okay, anyway, this friend of mine, they did some research on the Welsh, and they came back to me a few days later, and they're like, Bradley, we were the original oppressed people. We were the original people oppressed by the Anglo-Saxons. And, that got me thinking that I think the Rusyns do use that to their advantage as well. They do like to be looked at as... I'm not placing a value judgment here.
Yeah.
I'm just saying this is kind of what's happening in our early century here. Like, that the past of, not fitting in and being oppressed by the majority. I mean, in America, I don't know if there's a majority. I don't think there is. But that is just inherently appealing to people.
Well, it's kind of like, it's kind of like the whole like oppression Olympics kind of thing, to use it kind of buzzword,
exactly.
Right? Yeah. And like you'll notice for a lot of, shall I say, white Americans, like if they're, for example, Greek and English, they'll usually gravitate towards the Greek part. Or if they're like, Polish and German, they'll gravitate towards the Polish part. Like whatever is not seen as colonizers or bad, so to speak. I mean, I think that's certainly been a kind of major thing, or like whatever's kind of Oriental and kind of interesting.
Even myself, like when I brought up my ethnicity in the early beginning of the channel or the video, I am like 30% English.
Yeah.
And that didn't even cross my mind as something I should say. So there is that. Exactly. And I think there's also that with Germans and Scandinavians and Dutch Americans. They really underplay it. So
I mean, like any like Western, any like ancestry from like former Western European colonizers or whatever you want to call them. I mean, all of those are like significantly underplayed. Not France for some reason. I haven't really found, but the French get off easy, I suppose, because they don't speak English very well.
They're still exotic, I guess.
No.
But so I'm sorry if I'm talking too much about me, but I do think it ties into a lot of what you're devoting your life to right now. So I think it's worthwhile talking about. But I'm Swedish on both sides. My mom and my dad. From my mom with the I suspect it's like the original New Sweden colony in eastern PA, Pennsylvania. With my dad, it's like late 1800s immigrants, just how the Rusyns came over, and even on my dad's side of the family, there was a very Swedish sounding surname that we called Eastern European. Oh yeah, that's probably Slovak. So it is interesting how, certain groups really do underplay
Yeah.
themselves, and I think the Rusyns don't do that.
No, we very much are very well.
I think
It's
I think
funny.
when
Like,
people don't know they're Rusyn, it's because of the well the term Rusyn and how it relates to Russian and
yeah.
Ruthenian. Maybe I'm
Well,
wrong.
well, and also, whatever Rusyns kind of assimilate into being Ukrainian Americans or like Russian Americans, I mean, they have no issue with being very proud of that either, right? Like I am Russian American to the very
Right.
core. I mean, I do think Rusyns have almost the opposite effect, where many in the homeland and in America want us to seem more Western than what we actually are. I mean, this is kind of like
Yeah.
the whole like Eastern, like some like Eastern European says they're in Central Europe kind of,
Right. Right.
thing. But we don't, we want to be seen like we are more Western, not more special or kind of exotic. So
Yeah. This is a great opportunity to talk about the West,
mm.
because you've written about it in
Oh, I have very,
Critique of
I have very
Western
many,
Influence.
yeah, I have very many issues with them.
And
But anyways,
I, your the things you said about economics, just, I mean, I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
With I have some notes here. Chapter 2, a corrupted economy, I think is when you get into it.
Sounds right.
The greatest influence coming from the West is its economic system.
Yeah.
I'm paraphrasing here, so let me know.
Yeah,
If
something
accurate.
like that.
Okay.
About
Transforming citizen-invested state power to private power. Don't remember what that meant.
Say it one more time.
Transforming citizen-invested state power to private power. So
yeah, I mean, this goes many things in terms of like, what used to be owned by the citizenry and owned by the kind of general government. You're getting privatization. You get foreign influence in terms of that. For example, say you have a railway system that has been nationalized in, say, Slovakia. I'm just giving an example.
Yeah.
And then with Western pressure and kind of the Western propaganda model of saying, hey, things will only get better if you privatize this and sell it off to wealthy investors. Somehow it'll get better. At the detriment of the citizenry that has to pay more for the tickets, lesser quality service. It's these kind of issues of sell enough government or citizen-led institutions into the hands of private investors, in which the citizenry gets less control over their own state.
Okay. So, I mean, to use a more, common leftist phrase, like this is like, the 1% owning a substantial amount of, I mean, I guess we're not just talking about wealth, but we're talking about things in general.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like the bourgeois internationalist class, who is completely rootless, has no desire for any type of local civic engagement, is now suddenly in control of all these supposed to be government institutions, or once were, under the kind of guise of, hey, it'll improve production and it'll improve, it'll improve quality standards and life will get so much better. Generally, that's usually not the case primarily, or it's more complicated than what it seems.
So it seems like, I'm just looking over some of these notes I took again.
Yeah.
Would you agree that the primary focus of, is it states or is it individuals, is continued growth, continued economic growth? I mean, I guess it's both.
Well, I mean, I think this is, again, another kind of fable of the bourgeois internationalist class, or like internationalist business class, is that, you kind of hear this thing of, hey, we need to do all these things to continue the growth of GDP. I mean, it's kind of like the cult of GDP, so to speak. I mean, it's like, the system must always grow no matter what, regardless of any other social or political concerns, right? And, it's kind of a thing of where the economy is a sort of kind of religion of these people, in the sense of that this is the ultimate, it is of ultimate importance.
Yeah. Of course, you're coming at it with a completely different angle, but do you know who Andrew Yang is?
Oh, yes, I do. I do know who
Okay.
Andrew Yang is.
So that human-centered capitalism, I mean, would you agree with that phrase? Not exactly how he spells it out, but...
Yeah, I mean, I don't take him very seriously, honestly. I mean, for many of his ideas...
I'm not talking about UBI. I'm just talking about human-centered capitalism. No?
Honestly, I'd probably have to read more to give you a... I'd probably have to read more and kind of watch more of what he means by that.
Okay. Well, I mean, just on the face of it, what do you think of that term?
Human-centered capitalism? Is that what the term was?
Yeah.
Sounds like a nice corporate buzzword, honestly.
Yeah.
I mean, like, I think, I mean, it's one of those terms that, like, is supposed to mean something but doesn't really mean, much of anything. I mean, like, you could apply that to God knows how many different kind of ideological frameworks, right? I mean, like, you can, I don't know.
You're saying it's too broad.
Quite meaningless term, frankly. Yeah.
I mean, you talk about that in the book as well. So
meaningless term,
ironic
probably.
that I brought that corporate jargon up. So then you say, of course, a lot of this is obvious, but I do love the way you kind of laid it out here. Like birth rates in the West, I mean, that's a result of our increasingly transnational economic system.
In some sense, yes, it very much is. Okay. I mean, it's from the industrialization of that system. And there's also many factors in terms of, the kind of modernity as a kind of cultural economic force. But yeah, I would agree with that, yeah.
Okay. In Chapter 4, you talk about how Western companies, like the U.S. and Canada, they tend to sell their people out for, short-term benefits.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is a symptom of, like, corporatism in general, but yes, countries do it as well.
I mean, when do you think this began? Because do you think that in the Middle Ages, for example, that the rulers of a kingdom were they thinking long-term? Because I think you do imply that monarchs, I mean, you talk about constitutional monarchs, so it's totally different, but how monarchs do think about the long-term impact on their decisions on their country, whereas modern leaders don't because, they're elected every few years. Is there anything you'd want to elaborate on there? Did I characterize that correctly? I know it was very messy.
I mean, I think decently. I mean, like, I don't really see a question in it per se. Like, could you be more specific on the?
Yeah, sorry, I'm all over the place. I'm just trying to.
No, it's okay. It's
interpret. So I guess what do you mean by short-term benefits?
So this is a couple different links, so to speak. So, I mean, if we're talking about more generally, it's kind of the selling out of the lower classes for the prosperity of the kind of supposed total GDP and the kind of upper classes. I mean, that's pretty much what it is in a kind of general sense. I think that if you want to go into more specific kind of areas of that, I think it is quite heavily seen in corporate culture now in the sense of that a director may make a good business decision for the revenues of Q3, yeah? But that decision might, make a complete shitstorm 2 years down the road. But it doesn't matter to his bottom line because he's thinking of the next quarter or the next 2 quarters. And so it's this kind of connected with this is this kind of model of immediate profit and growth, and with no other type of worries about how it impacts it's the citizenry, their workers. I think this is a general trend, and I don't necessarily think like these people are necessarily evil in doing this. I think the system is kind of evil, if you want to use a kind of that general sense. But I think for many of these people,
the incentives are wrong. Would you?
Yes, I mean, like,
that?
I don't even think these people think about it, and I think because, I've talked with many of these people, I've had to, do different essays or stuff, and I've talked with like directors or people on like some boards of some big companies, and it's like they're not even thinking about that, and that's because, like you said, the incentives are wrong. And so, I mean, there's many different things at play here, but.
Okay. And so, yeah, when you, I guess I was thinking more of, and that was a perfect answer, but I was thinking of short-term benefit when it comes to politicians.
Oh, well, that's another area
well.
too. I mean, if
I
you want to
pretty
get
similar.
Yeah, I mean, this is getting into the whole kind of like, constitutional monarchy versus, just straight up republic here. But I mean, I think generally speaking, there's this one thing of that. I completely forgot what country it was or what study it was. So I may be totally like off here, but I remember there's one study on that. Some country or some government, they wanted to limit corruption by shortening election terms, or like shortening terms in office. And the issue with that, because they said, if someone's in government for 2 years, they're going to do a much better job than someone who's in 6 who can slack off or can be hidden behind the scenes. But what they found was that these people are constantly campaigning, and they're only looking at the next 12 months, 18 months in front of them. And so it actually led to more corruption. And I think in general, politicians, especially elected politicians, are going to do what's in the best interest for them, generally speaking, so that they can stay in power. I mean, this is for all political figures in general, mostly, but it's that altruism is in very short supply in politics, in that, they make decisions in which will look good for them 3 years from now, but when you have the Rust Belt occur 20 years later, like, are people going to look back and like blame you? Or, you're probably already going to be dead if you're, if you were 50 or 60 by the time you got into office, right? So by that time. So, I mean, it's a very short-term game overall.
Right. So, I mean, you do talk about constitutional monarchy, and I'm wondering if an analogy could be made with a, let's say, a family-owned business. Is someone who's running a family-owned business, and they're under the assumption that their son or daughter will inherit the business. Are they going to make better decisions than you were talking about, I think you were talking about these large scale businesses, where they're looking out for the, essentially they're trying to play the stock game. I mean, do you think you can draw an analogy between a family-owned business and a constitutional monarchy, or is that not at all similar?
Well, somewhat yes, but I think, so I would say yes, somewhat yes. I would say one of the biggest things is that it doesn't necessarily need to be so altruistic as, hey, I'm going to make sure this business is good so that life for my kids are, or so it's easier for my kid to take it over, or like, or it's like more like, I want this to be great so that this can carry on and it'll just be, lovey-dovey or like whatever. One of the big pluses of the monarchy, of the monarch system is in the sense that, how well you do is also going to affect the legitimacy of your descendants in that way. And that it's not just so that they have a good system that they can run. So it's not just that making sure there's not crap all over the hallways and that people like are actually competent. It's the sense of that it is playing political figures' desire for power and to maintain power. It essentially controls them in a sense of that they cannot be so horrible. Otherwise, they will lose that legitimacy and they will lose that kind of throne, so to speak. And so this is a kind of thing of where, it's almost playing on people's ambitions so that they do a better job rather than any altruistic purpose or goal.
Okay, and how would someone lose the throne? I mean, are the people operating under some system of like right to revolution, like John Locke?
I think it's,
or is there going to be
certainly certainly John Locke, but I also think, you can find this in almost any culture. I mean, if you look at the Chinese, it's the kind of mandate of heaven, right?
Okay.
They have a very much, I'm sure, I don't know if you know about that, but it's very much similar system. I mean, I think that, in this case, the whole point is to not get to the point where revolution or, abdication is a real possibility. And I think, like, in this sense, that constitutional monarchy, it is, how should I say it? There is downsides in the sense that there are situations in constitutional monarchism in which things have a much greater possibility of going horribly wrong, more people dying, more chaos than let's say a dysfunctional republic. But my kind of bet essentially is that that overall as a well-working state, these kind of greater highs and lows is kind of worth it in that sense versus a kind of just general kind of shall we say, incompetency.
Right. So now it's just because it's been a while since I've read this, but
yeah,
a lot of your critique is primarily economic, correct?
In terms of what exactly?
Well, the critique on Western influence.
Oh, well, yes, I would say primarily. Well, it's the influence of it's the way they influence power, I would say, or it's like the way they use their power to get other nations to do what they're doing. I think, and primarily, like, much of it is economics, and that I would say it's how they get a stranglehold on many countries. But I'm pretty sure it's been a long time since even I've read it, frankly.
Yeah.
I read so much stuff. I believe one chapter was on culture, if I'm not mistaken. I have many problems with, shall we say, the Russian sphere, right? Or the Chinese sphere. But one thing they do not do is, like, it's almost like, how should I describe it? The West plays a kind of a game where they will make themselves out to be this virtuous, beautiful force for justice and peace in the world, where really, perhaps in domestic policy, they're better in many ways than like the Russians or Chinese, but in international politics, they're no better, or perhaps even worse. And so my critique is that of how, to use kind of modern language, of how fake their image is, or the image that they try to portray. And my main reason for writing the book was, of course, failing in terms of the Rusyn vision, but also in the sense of that, do not be so fooled as though you will be treated as an equal in this kind of international world order. If you were to join that world order, you will have to kowtow to certain things by these greater powers. And so that was my main point of the book.
Okay, and now what does constitutional monarchy, in the way that you've described it, do you think it is the antidote to each one of these critiques, or is there a specific aim that constitutional monarchy has? As in, what is constitutional monarchy trying to eliminate? What's wrong with republicanism?
I think how I look at this, and this is actually why I wrote that chapter specifically, aside from the reasons of combating, selling out your people for economic interests of the elites and things like that, which is obviously plays a part in that chapter. It's the thing of that I've seen throughout many kind of new nation states in the modern era, or perhaps things like this, is that a kind of topping out, so to speak, of their potential, of their ability to go from a kind of middle-income country and they can't really get above that, or horrible corruption in these kind of barely working republics, honestly. And so my point is that, and this is kind of a greater image, in that I'm actually writing a fourth book, which will probably be my last for quite a long time. It's actually like, it's longer than those 3 books put together, so it's quite
okay.
It's the sense of that we must create a system in which we can achieve our potential as quickly as possible, so that we as a people can retain our sense of sovereignty, or our actual sovereignty, but also, just ability to survive. My biggest concern with Rusyn has always been is that we have no power, no institutional power, nothing. And I feel very strongly that if we screw, like, say, any part of Carpathian Rus gains independence within the next, say, 20, 30 years, it will be stuck in this kind of middling, failing republic incompetency dynamic, right? So this is my main concern of looking 30 years down the road. This is my kind of critique of, hey, perhaps we need a little bit less of this kind of Western model to be able to succeed and be able to reach where we want to go, but we might not make it there if we do these things.
Okay. So thank you. You've spelled a lot out there. I do have to wonder, though, how hypothetical is this constitutional monarchy? And how realistic do you... I assume if you do think it's realistic, it is like 30, 50 years down.
Oh, I think it's 30. It's not going to be 10 years. It'll be 30 to 50 years. I think generally, do I think an independent Rusyn state will happen in my lifetime? Probably. Depending on what area. Well, at least in the terms of on the level of, say, how Crimea was before it got annexed, or like what's their name? Essentially, if not total sovereignty, at least being a republic inside another state. Okay. And so, I truly think what will probably happen is that whatever region of Carpathian Rus gains independence or some really greater autonomy, they're going to bumble around for a decade, maybe 15 years in this kind of failing republicanism model. And then that's where you kind of plant the seeds for this type of government going forward. This is a kind of thing of where if this would happen, I would be an old man by the time it would be instated. Yeah.
Yeah. It is interesting, though, because it does really require the exclusion of foreign influence, whether it be Russia or the West and the U.S. I don't think it's ever going to be possible for most European countries to work outside of the influence of larger states and coalitions.
Well, I just think that's the basics of geopolitics, yes. I think this is something of where, though, that as long as you can align the bare minimum with the interests of whatever state is kind of, the presiding one over your area, you can do pretty much whatever you want within that. And it kind of just, it's very location specific, right? So, for example, like the Saudis, they can have their not even constitutional monarchy. They can have their monarchy. They can have whatever they want, as long as they're still allies to the U.S. because of their oil reserves, because of their strategic location. I mean, so these are all things that kind of come into
Okay.
play here. So
How are we doing on time?
I have another 2 hours. So whatever you want to talk about is whatever you want to talk about.
Well, I'm sorry. I feel kind of bad about talking to you so much about the monarchy thing, but I do think it's, I mean, that's the thing that sticks out in your book. You're like, whoa,
Yeah.
what is he advocating for? Monarchy? Okay, let me look into this a bit.
Yeah.
And I think if you haven't read the book, this is going to sound like a radical change in the world order. Like this would not be possible. I mean, not even does Belarus have a king? He's not a king. He's just
A
the
dictator. Yeah, he's just a dictator.
So, I mean, a king in Europe with real power. So is the UK a constitutional monarchy? Because I don't think they have a constitution.
No, they're not. They're kind of, I forgot the exact name for it, but I mean, the Queen has no power. I mean,
right.
And I state all these things in my book kind of from a general stance that I don't think the international world order is going to be there when I'm middle-aged or when I'm older. I mean, I'm very much in the realm of that. The West is kind of in decline in general. And I think that this is opening up many possibilities going into the next couple of decades. So, I think it would be insane now. Will it be insane in 30 years? I don't necessarily think so.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know if there's ever going to be a definitive collapse. I mean, of course, this is all just up in the air.
Oh, of course, kind of like hypothetical. Of course.
Yeah. But if there were to be like a definitive real collapse, like something like the Great Depression or worse, World War, I mean, you were going to have so many factions fighting for the new regime and to institutionalize their own idea of how the future should be. So it would be interesting if I came across some more constitutional monarchists, because I think you're the only one I've ever spoken to.
Probably, honestly. Yeah.
So how I guess you don't detail it too much, but how much would the Constitution limit the monarch, and how much power would the monarch have in your hypothetical dream Rusyn state?
I would say as much general, just to kind of be brief on it, because I think there is other topics we could actually definitely reach. I would say, in to kind of give a general term, I would say probably as much national and kind of geopolitical power as perhaps Xi Jinping has. But what is limited by that is, I would say in terms of like control over the citizenry, I would think that would be the major reduction in their power. So, for example, essentially you would have much of the same rights as, for example, U.S. citizens have, but in terms of national projects and in terms of international relations, you would have they would have a much stronger, shall we say, power in that regard. So, for example, a lot of the bureaucratic systems in which has been plagued, you wouldn't have it wouldn't take you, 20 years to make a subway system in Boston or whatever, however long that subway took or whatever. So, I mean, it's kind of a thing of on a grander national scale while still making sure that the rights of the citizenry is quite well protected.
Okay.
Well, and also from the standpoint of that, I'm not a constitutional monarchist in the sense that I think necessarily everyone should be appointed by the king, so to speak. I mean, I think there is much room for local democracy, like whether it be governorships, which are elected or appointed. This is all very hypothetical, but I think there is certainly a level where, the town councilman does not need to get appointed. You can vote on who your town, local councilman is. I think that there will be dysfunction in that, but I think there is a trade-off of here where you can't necessarily go straight to one extreme or, straight to the other. I think there needs to be some type of will of the people, so to speak, in their daily lives.
Yeah, and I of course am, like many people, I'm initially very skeptical, but I think if you do insert the right checks and balances, and I think you write about how a lot of our current checks and balances aren't doing a great job.
Yeah, they're just complete jokes. Yeah.
So if you are able to implement that, it's possible. I'm not opposed to the idea. I would probably like to see a good example of it before I would advocate for it, though.
Well, here's the thing that I find. Here's what I think is like the biggest issue in terms of republicanist systems, so to speak, or just kind of general democracy, is I think that in large part this kind of these constant elections, these constant supposed democratic elements, they very much hinder the creation of great statesmen. They very much hinder the creation of visionaries, because all these people, they get filtered out at the lower levels of government, or even the mid-level. So you have kind of, you can see this in America now, where, do we have any statesmen on the same level of, like, I really dislike him, but for example, like Henry Kissinger. Do we have someone as competent on that level in the government right now? I think you'd be hard-pressed to find one. Do you have someone like George Washington, just to call a very old name out? Do you have someone of that great statesmanship in government right now? And so I think you're at a point where the bureaucracy and, we are being run by bureaucrats who have no true vision. They're all part of the managerial class that, all kind of grew out of that kind of social strata. It's very hard to implement any changes you actually need from that. So that's kind of my final point on that, I would say.
Okay, yeah, I'm sorry for talking about that.
No,
it is a very interesting. Yeah. I don't think I've heard you elaborate much on it before. So.
Oh, you're gonna get a lot of chapters on it, so be ready.
Oh boy. Okay. Yeah. Do you have anything you want to hint for your new book?
It is. With the current situation, I'd probably rather not, actually.
Okay,
so
that's fine. That's fine.
One day you'll find out. So.
Okay. Yeah, no, I've been leading the discussion for a while. Is there anything that you would like to talk about, or do you want to wrap it up?
I suppose you haven't asked me much on geopolitics, I suppose, or where you think, or where you want, my opinion on, shall we say, where Rusyn stand in a literal sense between East and West, or, my current stance on the war, things like this. I'm certainly open to talking about them. Like, I'll let you know if it's like a little bit too
yeah,
intense.
I don't know. I guess I'm not aware of anything too interesting. Of course, the war going on right now is awful, and I assume the many Rusyns are that they follow that same line of thought. What were you thinking?
About the war?
About geopolitics.
Oh, geopolitics.
Or the war going on.
Sure. Well, I think with Russia, they never sign any real treaties, right? So I think that's a thing of where they're just an unstoppable machine in some sense of that. Sure, they may shall we say, kind of diminished at some point, only to be rebirthed later. I think that in this particular instance, I think the war was caused by the incredible shoddiness of Ukrainian statesmanship, in the sense of that, of course, Russia is at fault for invading and for their war crimes and such, but I think that the Ukrainian government, as it stood, they could have been much better in terms of preventing this from occurring. And and I'm not talking about any type of morality here. I'm just talking about from the sense that they really didn't do anything to calm the tensions, so to speak, and they didn't. They went full ahead on this kind of NATO talk, which is never going to happen. I mean, just to be honest, no realistic situation will ever occur where Ukraine, in its current form, will be part of NATO. You can talk about the Galician Ukrainians kind of branching off and them becoming part of NATO, but this is just not a real possibility, especially with the east of Ukraine, which is more heavily Russified, shall we say. I just think for all of us, I think we do think it's a quite a horrible thing, and I think that Russia has never been our ally, no matter how much the Ukrainians have done or the Ukrainian state has done, which has been quite a lot. The Russian state they just use us as pawns, and so we've been very well accustomed to their propaganda now.
Right. It is interesting because you are so hesitant against Western influence, but of course you are against Russian influence as well. So, I guess even before 2014, do you think Ukraine should have leaned more into NATO and the EU? Or are you one of those who think they should have tried to be independent? I mean, I like that line of thought. I just find it very improbable.
I think
independent Ukraine kind of thing.
I think there's no way in which they would have remained independent or neutral. I just don't think it was going to happen. I think that's the philosophical ideal. I think that would be this, philosophical ideal for them. I don't think it would ever realistically happened. I think there's many issues with, if we're talking just about Ukraine in general, or just like the Rusyns in particular.
I meant Ukraine in general.
Okay, fine.
Because I assume you would want a similar inclinations for different types of people, not just the Rusyns.
Yeah.
Or am I incorrect?
No, I think you're pretty correct in that sense. I think Ukraine as a state is untenable without authoritarian policies. And I'm being entirely, I'm not being facetious in that way, and that I think that quite literally, I don't think the state as it currently functions can survive. Does that mean their territorial integrity should have been taken away from them? No, I don't think so. But I think these questions have been kicked down the road or only kind of strengthened. I think the only way truly they could have gone perhaps independent would be in the sense of that they rejected Western and Russian influence primarily, but then promoted a kind of independent Ukrainian kind of mythos, which the current government is quite heavily linked with kind of the Western sense of of what to do. I think you have the problem with Crimea, which, to be honest with you here, if we're talking about morally, Russia shouldn't have invaded. If we're talking about geopolitically, nobody wanted to be part of Ukraine there. Nobody. You can count maybe some of the Tatars and some of the Ukrainians there. But, the place is like 80% Russian. No one wanted to, if you look at polls, no one wanted to be part of Ukraine. The Donbass is another complicated case. Very Soviet mindset still. Always, have pretty much always primarily wanted to be part of Russia. So, these are issues here that are hard to ignore, right? I think we do see a kind of shift, though, in the sense that areas in which one would have thought would have been welcoming to Russian annexation, like, shall we say, Odessa, Kharkiv. These places which are Russian-speaking have kind of tilted towards the Ukrainian orientation in many ways, especially since the start of this war. So it's not all set out in stone, but, for example, I don't think, for example, like Kherson or the Donbass or the bottom of Zaporizhia is ever going to truly be Ukrainian again. I don't think.
What is going to be Ukrainian again?
Oh God, man, I'm not a war expert. But if I would predict, I would say that, at least for right now, the only thing I can say is I don't think anything they hold right now, with including the entirety of the Donbass region, is going to be Ukrainian within the foreseeable future, within the foreseeable decades.
Mm-hmm.
That's not saying I don't necessarily want it to be part of Ukraine, because I think this sets a very bad precedent in terms of, like, hey, a country can just go in and annex their lands, annex some countries' lands because they want to. But I'm just talking about it realistically here.
How shocked were you when? I guess I wasn't too shocked. But I was going to ask, how shocked were you when Russia invaded Ukraine?
I was shocked that it was such a total assault. I truly thought that they were going to announce the annexation of the entire Donbass region. I did not expect them to try to do their kind of blitzkrieg, trying to take Kiev, all these other regions. I knew that Kherson might have been an issue just from the standpoint of that Crimea, its water supply was dwindling, and Russia had to send in water from other regions of Russia to supplement that, and it was getting dammed within the Kherson Oblast. So I think that one was another concern. Pretty much where they are right now is what I kind of thought would happen in terms of if they did invade. How far they go, I have no idea, because I truly think their first attempt was a complete failure, in the sense of that I think they truly thought they would take Kiev in a couple of days, and people would be much more willing to have this kind of like Russian government in there. And I think it was a real intelligence failure on their part.
How do you think the Russians and Ukrainians are doing now? It's hard to tell what we're getting, if it's true or not.
I think it's complicated. I think that, the areas they've taken right now, they had a lot of people flip over to the Russian side. I think that, like I said...
I didn't know about that. Why is that?
Just from the standpoint of that, can I say specific cases? No, not necessarily. But there was many kind of, how should I say, like Russifal mayors, some specific, units, things like that. In other kind of areas, though, it was surprising in that the Russian-speaking population seems largely very much against the invasion, like, Kharkiv, Odessa. It's very mixed bag. I think that you're not going to really be able to tell 100% until after the war is done, frankly, in terms of what they were thinking at that time.
What do you think this war is going to be remembered for? You mentioned the precedent it sets.
Mm-hmm.
How important is that? Do you really think Russia is interested in expanding further?
I think they're interested. I think in their perfect world, they would probably take Moldova as well. Probably.
Okay. Yeah.
I think in their perfect world, they'd probably do that, all of Ukraine and Moldova. In terms of kind of a worldwide scale, I think this is kind of, for many, I think they will try to, I think many Western people will try to portray this as the kind of like the, reuniting of the global world order. I think this is the start of the end of the global world order. I think this is really the first domino to fall. I think some areas you have to look very closely on in the next 4 to 5 years, Taiwan and China. I think Afghanistan and Pakistan with the Durand line and the Pashtuns there. I think many of these cases you're going to start seeing that if Russia can do it and they're still standing and the current government is still in power, I think you're going to see a movement towards doing stuff like this.
So, if we get some of these examples you listed, if some of these events play out, such as, Taiwan being taken by China, is that really going to disrupt the current world order? Is NATO going to be divided on these, on the responses to these events?
I don't think the Western world is going to collapse and be some type of apocalypse. I think what will happen, though, is that they will retreat from the global stage, and there will be a rise. I don't think there will be necessarily a decrease in globalization. I think there will be an increase in regionalism. So, for example, I think you'll see, for example, Turkey kind of expanding its influence. You will see India expanding its influence, and I think it'll be a thing of where instead of you have the U.S. as this global power and the civilized world, however they call it, I think it'll be. I think you will have regional powers kind of take a much more important role once again.
Okay, and we've been at it for a while here, so. If we do want to tie it back to the Rusyns in Ukraine really quick.
Sure, go on.
I mean, what is it going to look like for them after the war?
I think it depends on how the war goes, I suppose. I wrote an article about this on RLS. I mean, I would say generally, I think that if it ends in some type of stalemate, it's going to be a horrible situation for Rusyns in general. Horrible. I see just a rise of Ukrainian ultranationalism. I see the kind of disparaging of any kind of national minorities. I think if it ends in a Ukrainian victory, I'm not exactly sure. And I think if it ends in some part of Ukraine joining the EU, I think there is some hope there. I'm not as sold as perhaps some of my colleagues are. But I mean, no situation is going to be that great, if I'm being entirely honest. No situation is going to be, I mean, it's just not, it's just a mixed bag all around. And I can say that because I'm in America, but you wouldn't catch anyone over there saying that right now with the kind of political climate there is. So.
Yeah, and it is, of course, perhaps ridiculous to speculate to some extent. I mean, we don't know where things are going to go.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to talk about?
Well, I'd like to say thank you for having me on, by the way. This has been my favorite interview ever, frankly, that I've done. So I mean, you've done a wonderful job.
Yeah, I'm very new to it. I had no clue how hard it was. I thought I would just, hop on and ask you some questions, but it is difficult. I'm very glad that you have such long-winded answers, though.
Well, yeah, I mean, it gives you time to think of another one.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
But, yeah.
I guess what would you say to, hopefully this introduced some people to the Rusyns who weren't familiar. Do you have anything additionally you'd like to say to them? Who weren't familiar with Rusyns until now? I mean, is there anything else they need to know? Are they supposed to be, do people have an obligation to be advocates for, I don't want to say, I guess minority groups, whether it's the Rusyns or the Bretons in France or anything like that?
I think this is interesting question to end on, I suppose, because I don't think we necessarily talked much about Rusyn political history per se. I think we talked about like a lot of good themes, but not necessarily Rusyn political thought or like Rusyn identity as it stands today.
Yeah,
I
that was
mean,
somewhat conscious. I'm
yeah,
kind of
yeah,
a big picture kind of guy.
yeah. I mean, like, I think in general terms, I think that I would love to give you a final philosophical answer. I mean, I think
Sure.
I would love for people to learn more and say, hey, we hope you guys' rights are respected, and I hope that you are, you can live freely. I just don't really buy into the whole minority solidarity thing, though, to be frank with you. And so I appreciate the opportunity to tell people.
No, I mean,
I always love,
yeah,
giving people information about kind of like Rusyns and like my ideas. But all that you can do is just kind of give us some more support and, just all there.
sure. I mean, just to push back a little bit, it
Yeah.
is important to be conscious that these groups exist, and that nations are not monolithic, and I guess those general kind of things. And there's thousands of stateless ethnic groups.
I think that's, I think you have a point there. I think you have a good point if you're talking about, I mean, I think that's very important, and I think having a deeper understanding of how states work, I think, is very important. And like how you think there's these monolithic countries, and it's really not. So I mean, I think from a learning perspective, I think that's very important. I think from a real world applicability, I'm just not exactly sold on it. We should talk about this earlier. This would have been a wonderful debate.
Oh, I know. We could always do this again if you're willing.
So.
Yeah, what else? Is there anything that I didn't leave out? No, I think we're good.
All right, wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again for having me on. I really loved talking with you.
Yeah, thank you.